I Hate the News is the weekly news analysis from I Hate Politics podcast, a show about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. The week of March 12th, 2024, Washington, D.C. and Maryland passed controversial public safety bills. The D.C. bill relaxes restrictions on chokeholds, for example. The Maryland bill lowers the age of juveniles who can be charged with crimes to 10 years. Yes, to include fifth graders. A new report looks at how DC schools did in 22-23. And the Supreme Court refuses to hear a case of reverse discrimination in the Northern Virginia magnet school, Thomas Jefferson High School. Music for this episode comes from Baltimore area jazz musician Seth Keibel's album, Clarinet Flicks and Chill. Keibel on clarinet, flute, and tenor saxophone, Ellington Carthan on piano and keys, Christy McDonald electric guitar, Elliot Seppa double bass, and Joey Antico drums. Stay with us. The District of Columbia and the state of Maryland passed controversial public safety bills last week. But if you saw the vote count, you wouldn't know that the measures were any controversial. The Maryland bill passed the House of Delegates 126-6, and the state Senate 45-2. The DC bill passed 12-0 with one abstention. Those who led the passage of the bills, Councilmember Brooke Pinto and Mayor Muriel Bowser in D.C., and Luke Clippinger and Will Smith, the chairs of the Maryland House and Senate Judiciary Committees, respectively, have pointed to the preponderant support as indicating widespread concern about public safety in the state and in the legislature. But there has been plenty of opposition for both bills. Retired federal judges Andre M. Davis, formerly of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and Nancy Gertner, formerly of the U.S. District Court of Massachusetts, wrote in the Baltimore Banner, "Arresting more 10, 11, and 12-year-olds not accused of violent crime will not improve public safety in Maryland. Neither will doubling terms of probation for 80% of kids. All that will happen is that more children in the state will be detained, especially black and brown children, who will eventually be released, impaired by their experience." Just 2 years ago, the Maryland General Assembly had passed the Juvenile Justice Reform Act, raising the age from 10 to 13. So there is a question about why this reversal. Those who want to lower the age restriction back down point to an increase in juvenile crimes. In January 2024, Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy said juvenile gun offenses in his jurisdiction were up 220% in 2023 over 2022. And carjackings increased by 200%. Shootings by juveniles rose from 16 in 2019 to 40 in 2023. And auto thefts increased from 44 to 364. He did not specify how many of these juveniles were under 13, which is the focus of the new bill. Wycomico County State's Attorney Jamie Dykes criticized the 2022 reforms, saying it prevents questioning of juvenile suspects. Presumably, this means that police and prosecutors believe there are juvenile suspects under the age of 13 that need to be questioned. Vince Schiraldi, director of the state's Department of Juvenile Services, has offered contradictory data. He has said that complaints against children under 13 fell dramatically from 1,100 in 2022 to 301 in 2023. By raising the minimum age for charging children with a crime to 13 years, proponents argue younger at-risk children who used to be able to use the Department of Juvenile Services programs are no longer eligible for them, which presumably then has contributed to the increase in crime. It is the case that the 2022 juvenile justice reforms have lacked follow-up in providing more youth services outside the juvenile justice system. And now these are very unlikely given the budget situation. The House and Senate versions of the bill still need to be reconciled. In the DC Council, the Secure DC bill had a much larger remit, but also reversed police reforms from a few years ago that, for example, limited neck restraints following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. The new law also relaxes limits on vehicle pursuits, enables longer pre-trial detention and DNA collection, prohibits face masks, expands authority to designate drug-free zones even as marijuana is made legal in the region, expands what constitutes carjacking, creates a new category of offense called organized retail theft that includes planning and directing such activities, increases penalties for property theft, and allows parole officers to impose penalties for parole violations without going back to the courts. Will all these measures help bring crime down in Washington, D.C.? The causal connection between expanded policing authority and crime rates is at best indirect. More police powers gives the police greater authority for a broader crackdown. Arrest more people for more reasons, keep them longer in detention, and then monitor their activity more closely when released. So the intervening variable is really empowering police department, which, among other things, is believed to lead to less staffing shortages and hence greater police effectiveness. If you look at regional crime data, suburban Maryland, Baltimore, and D.C. have seen the worst of it, but Northern Virginia jurisdictions appear to have been spared somewhat, including being spared the politics of crime. In the National Capital Region, Prince George's County and D.C. have the highest incidence of crime, but there are big differences as well between Fairfax County in Virginia and Montgomery County in Maryland. Crime numbers across the region were down in 2023 from 2022, so already the policy changes are lagging. But Montgomery remains significantly higher than Fairfax. Data from the Major Cities Police Chiefs Association shows, for example, Fairfax reported 120 rapes to Montgomery County's 380. Fairfax has a slightly higher population. But if you look at arrest data, Fairfax arrested 6,587 persons in 2022 to Montgomery's 2,865. The ratio is about the same even when adjusted for population. Both jurisdictions have roughly 2,000 uniform and civilian employees in their police departments, though Fairfax has more in uniform and Montgomery has more civilian employees. The police shortage in Fairfax is believed to be about 200 officers and in Montgomery to be about 300. In education news, DC Policy Center came out with a new State of DC Schools report for 22-23, the first full school year of in-person learning after the pandemic.
The areas where DC has returned to pre-pandemic levels are in things like educator retention, which was lower than national levels pre-pandemic, and suspensions, which again, DC was somewhat of an outlier in that respect as well. We did see some bright spots starting with enrollment. This was the first year that enrollment in DC had increased since the pandemic began. We're seeing that last school year, 44% of students were chronically absent, which means they missed 10% or more of the school year. And this is a decrease from that first year back from the pandemic by about 4 percentage points, but it's much higher, 14 percentage points higher than it was pre-pandemic. The big picture in terms of the outcomes on the statewide assessment in DC, we see that we're seeing in that 22% of students meet or exceed expectations compared to 31% before the pandemic. The gap is smaller in English language arts. 34% of students meet or exceed expectations compared to 37% before the pandemic. A really important distinction that we draw out in the larger report is the difference in recovery for in these outcomes for elementary and middle school students who did see those gains, and for high school students for whom results remained flat.
What about teacher shortage?
The number of teachers in the system increased by 7%, and this is again compared to enrollment increase of around 2%.
That's Chelsea Coffin, Education Policy Director at the DC Policy Center. Last month, the U.S. Supreme Court turned down hearing a local education case from Northern Virginia where some parents, primarily of Asian origin, backed by the conservative Pacific Legal Foundation, filed suit against Fairfax County Public Schools over admission policies at the Thomas Jefferson High School, one of the district's highly regarded magnet programs. University of Maryland Asian American Studies professor Janelle Wong explains.
They said they weren't going to hear it. At least the majority said they weren't going to hear it. And they did so because they said there was not enough evidence of discrimination. There was a dissent. Two of the justices, Alito and Thomas, did provide a dissent, and they really leaned into the model minority stereotype. They said that Asian Americans were working hard to get in and they were going to be disadvantaged. The evidence that they used was that there was a difference in the proportion of Asian Americans admitted prior to the reform and after the reform. So we did see a drop in the overall proportion. However, the reason I think the majority did not take up this case, and it is not going to be taken up, is because that is the wrong metric. Prior to the reforms, a little over 70% of Thomas Jefferson High School was made up of Asian American students. After the reforms, it dropped down to 54, 56%. But prior to the reforms, there was one low-income Asian American student in the year they were looking at. And after the reforms, there were 50 low-income Asian American students. And so to say that this is anti-Asian discrimination, in some ways, that does not hold any water. The whole reason that these cases have come up is because there has been some attention to magnet schools, public magnet schools, because they have not been serving the students in their counties in an equitable way. So Thomas Jefferson, had less than 1% of its class was low income prior to these reforms. And afterwards, that changed dramatically. And so one of the reasons that they have instituted these reforms is to increase access. At the same time, as they have moved to increase access, conservative legal activist groups like the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is made up of entirely almost of white men, have sued these schools and said that they are intentionally discriminating against Asian Americans because of the change to the status quo.
University of Maryland professor Janelle Wong. That's all for this episode. Be sure to tune in here at I Hate Politics this Friday for our big feature interview. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producers Daniel Gallio, Katarina Gasek, and Catherine Amaya Escobar, with support from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Baltimore area jazz musician Seth Keibel. The songs are from his album Clarinet Flicks and Chill. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihbpod.org. See you next time.